Thank you, Swati. Good afternoon, everybody. We have a lot to get through today, so let me go ahead and introduce our topics, and then I will get started with the content. On today's call, we actually will be splitting the content. The first half will focus on some DMS updates. The DMS implementation team has been working hard to restart our DMS 2.0 process. So if you're a cohort 1 state, you probably have already heard or will soon hear from our DMS team. The team is reaching out to contact cohort 1 states and start arranging for on-site monitoring visit dates, as well as the protocol discussions and submission of documents. Today, Brenda Wilkins, Kate Moran, and Matt Schneer will be providing you with the updates of where we are in the process and what to expect next. The second part of our call will focus on the return to school roadmap. Many of you probably know that OSEP on September 30th released a document called Development and Implementation of Individualized Education Programs. It's quite a lengthy document, but there's quite a bit of important content in it. Lisa Pagano, OSEP's policy specialist, will provide an overview of this important document. Time permitting, she may also discuss the August 24th Dear Partners letter, as well as the Child Find Q&A document. Then I have some logistic announcements that I want to briefly cover. There will only be one national TA call in November. That will be on Thursday, November 18th. And this is because there are 2 holidays in the month that occur on those Thursdays when we would typically be having our calls. The focus of our national TA call in November will be on DMS, and we will circulate the call information in the very near future. Also want to ask that you save the date for 2 upcoming webinars regarding the APR reporting tool. The first one will be on Tuesday, December 14th from 2 to 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time. That will be part C. And then the following day, Wednesday, December 15th, also 2 to 3:30, we will have a call on the part B APR reporting tool. We'll be sending out notices of that if you didn't get all that information, but I thought it would be important for you to be aware that those 2 calls will be coming up and preparing you for the opening of our system and the submission of your data. Call information will be circulated by the Partner Support Center and posted on the GRADS website and the Engage OSEP website. One more thing before we, I wanted to mention that we lost a dear colleague and friend, Rhonda Weiss, who was an attorney in the Office of General Counsel and had for many years been working very closely with OSEP, primarily on Part B. Rhonda was highly skilled, highly knowledgeable about Part B, IEP, and IDEA services. She was engaged in almost all of the major documents that we released to states, including monitoring reports, but especially the policy documents, including the one that we're going to be talking about later on today. And this is a terrific loss for us and for the field. Rhonda was such a valued colleague, and we will miss her tremendously. I'm going to then turn our call over to Brenda Wilkins from our DMS implementation team. Brenda, are you ready?
I'm ready, Greg. Thank you. So thank you, Greg, for those words. Rhonda Weiss, we're definitely going to miss her. So yeah, so I just wanted to go into the DMS 2.0 cohort 1 and 2 monitoring schedule. As you can see on the screen, A lot of states, we're almost through all of the kickoff calls for cohort 1 states. And those will be done within the next couple of weeks or so. And then here is the schedule for cohort 2. As you can see, there's a lot more states under cohort 2, but we will have kickoff calls with them next year. And so you have some time to look at the protocols, do self-assessments with your state. So just be mindful that that information is there and ready for you to utilize. And the site link to our IDEA website is below. Next slide, please. So we thought it was important to give you monitoring team members in each of the different teams. So as you can see, there's team A, team B, team C, and team D. And under each team, you'll see the component leads for fiscal, monitoring and improvement, and then data, dispute resolution, TA and PD, and then of course the state lead, who is the lead for your team. And when you have questions or concerns, you gear all of your questions to your state lead, as they are an integral part of our team. Next slide, please. Kate, did you want me to go over this slide? Okay, so the DMS timeline. So in the kickoff calls that we had recently, we noticed that we want to just kind of highlight the dates of cohort 1 and cohort 2. So this month, of course, many of you had your kickoff calls for your phase 2 activities. So we wanted to go down this schedule. So in cohort 2, the official notification was sent this month, October 2021, and this site visits will be held, or we'll set the site visits in October 2022. Cohort 3, those notifications will go out in October 2022, and then we'll set the actual the visit in October 23. So it's always a year apart. So in cohort 4, it will be in October 2023, and of course 5 will be in 2024. Now we only issued out cohort 1 and cohort 2 states, and then 3, 4, and 5 will be issued at a later date. So right now I'm going to send it over to Kate Moran, and she will go over some more DMS information for you.
Thank you, Brenda. Sorry, I did jump on a little early, but that is your slide. So thank you for going through that information. And Swati, you can move to the next slide, please. All right, so we just wanted to review very quickly the timeline that we're looking at, just that reminder that it's a 6-month period. So our first visits our phase 2 visits will be occurring in May of 2022, and their document request will be coming in December of 2021. So from January through April, they'll be engaging with us, with their monitoring teams, reviewing those protocols, and then their on-site component would occur in May. Between June and September, we'd be developing that letter, and then the letter would be issued in September. So just wanted to highlight that timeline again. Next slide, please. This again is the visual. We've included this on the last 2 calls. We just really want to make sure that folks are seeing this information, that we begin to familiarize ourselves with it as it is new. It's still phases, so you can see phase 1 there in December. Phase 2 occurs in May, and then the phase 3 is going to be a year out from that September timeline of when that letter is issued. I can see one error on this slide, so I'll go in and correct that. So it says September and instead of October, but you can see the box is over September. So no matter how many eyes we have on these, sometimes we do find errors like that when we're live. Next slide, please, Swati. All right, we wanted to talk through, because we've received some questions about what that 4-month period might look like, what occurs during that time. Some of this information has been communicated over the cohort 1 kickoff calls that we've been having with states, but we wanted to share it with all states so you begin to see and familiarize yourself with this information as well. So as we've been talking about with that May visit, so the phase 2 on-site virtual component, the document request would come there in December. You can see that in blue. When we come into January, February, March, and April, you would work with your monitoring team to determine what protocols you might cover. So this is an example where in January, they're going to do the integrated monitoring for the first half of the month, and then the second half, they're going to set up calls on the sustaining compliance and improvement protocols. Then in February, in the beginning of the month, they're going to spend some days talking about that data protocol. And then the latter part of the month, they would begin dispute resolution. Since there's 3 protocols, maybe they'll do state complaints, moving into due process, and then finishing with mediation at the end of March. Again, those would be scheduled calls throughout the month. It's not going to be week long. It's probably going to be 2-hour sessions here and there. And that specific timeline and schedule you'll work out with your monitoring team and state lead. And then in April, we would engage in some phase 2 planning to get ready for your on-site virtual component. So you're clear on what information is going to be covered. It would be following up on the information your monitoring team has gathered throughout those months and reflecting back on verifying information they've heard, things that may be outstanding questions that they're going to follow up with in May. Moving to the next slide. One of the components that you will notice is not listed there is the TA and PD protocol. Although we see it as a piece of the puzzle, it will not be a separate protocol component. Scattered throughout each one of our protocols are questions related to how you're addressing training on particular areas of need within your program or state. So if we have integrated monitoring and how are you training staff on your monitoring procedures, things like that, those types of questions are going to be scattered across all of our pieces of our monitoring protocols and evaluations. So in dispute resolution, you'll see questions around how you're training your mediators and how are you ensuring that they have the information they need to carry out their duties, things like that. When we come to phase 2, if there is an area that needs further follow-up, so if there is an indicator in your APR data that you have had issues with, or there's been compliance issues, that we would be following up to find out, well, what training are you doing around that to hopefully impact that data and improve outcomes for kids, infants, toddlers, and children and youth with disabilities. So we see TA and PD as crossing over all of these areas. So we just wanted to confirm that we're not going to be posting a separate protocol, so don't be looking for that. The protocols that are posted right now are what we're going to be using during phase 1. And then we'll be following up during phase 2 with any additional follow-up that we need to do in this particular area. Next slide, please. All right, just circling back. For anyone who has missed it, this is where you can find all of the resources, the framework, our current protocols, the protocols you will be using during our monitoring are posted on the IDEA website. So you can see it's under resources, resources for grantees, and we've just kind of blown it up so you can see there all of the protocols listed out clearly. So we've got our general resources, which is the framework, going into our fiscal protocols, general supervision, and then dispute resolution, those 3 protocols that I mentioned. Below that is the monitoring schedule that Brenda, I miss Rhonda, that Brenda highlighted at the beginning of this call. So there you can see very clearly which states are in cohort 1, which states are in cohort 2, and you can begin those in 3 to 5 would be anybody outside of those currently posted protocol or cohorts. Next slide, please. All right, so a brief follow-up and update on phase 2 monitoring. We do just want to reiterate that phase 2 will look different for each state. So depending on your need or flexibility, we would like to provide some flexibilities within that so that if you want to do a couple of days at the beginning of the month, a couple of days later in the month, we would accommodate that. We also do see some nuances with stakeholder engagement to really engage a broader network across your state. Some of that may happen later in the day. That might be virtual just to make sure we're reaching out and hearing from your stakeholders, which could include locals, things like that. But more information and specifics would be worked out within your monitoring team when you talk with them. So we would be examining those implementation of policies and procedures to follow up on the information that we covered during phase 1. So some questions we've received are, well, what's different? What would you be asking about that you haven't already covered in phase 1? So just a reminder on that phase 1 is really a cursory review of your policies and procedures. So we're not really diving into that implementation piece of looking at actual documentation, looking at, so for instance, we might look at your monitoring system, your monitoring manual, but then when we come on site for phase 2, we might really be looking at some of those actual letters that you're sending, the monitoring finding reports that you're making for local programs or LEAs, things like that. We will address any concerns that we identified during phase 1 that we need to delve deeper into and get and do some follow-up on. Next slide. I think I'm turning it over to Matt. Yes, so Matt's going to go through some historical findings just to give you guys some more information on that. So take it away, Matt.
Thanks, Kate. Appreciate it. And good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to try to make this quick so we reserve as much time as possible for Lisa to go through really important information. But we just thought it might be useful to highlight some of the findings that we have made over the most recent years, both through DMS 1.0 and maybe even before that, both for Part C and Part B. So some things that you might want to think about for your own systems. I would just note we have at the bottom there the link for DMS, which has been shown before. In that same link, you can find links to all of our monitoring reports. So those are good resources for you if you have some questions. I don't want to go into any big detail here, but in Part C, we have recently made findings around states not meeting the full responsibility of single line of responsibility, of being able to demonstrate that they have a true fiscal monitoring system, that their general supervision system might not be reasonably designed to identify or verify correction of non-compliance for a variety of reasons. We also, although dispute resolution is not as prominent as it is for Part B, in Part C, we have found some issues on dispute resolution in Part C, for example, along with model forms and other things like that. So those are the kinds of things that you might want to think about for Part C. We can go on to the next slide, please. And then for Part B, similarly, we have a lot of general supervision findings in the fiscal area, some concerns around subrecipient monitoring, which could include a variety of things. They may not be issuing audit management letters, which is a part of subrecipient monitoring. They may not be doing a risk assessment as required or other things along those lines. Programmatic monitoring, similar issues around general supervision and whether or not the system is reasonably designed to both identify and correct noncompliance in a timely fashion. We've found in the fiscal area issues around LEA allocations. That's particularly true for states that have a lot of charter school LEAs where that becomes relatively complicated, particularly around issues of reallocations or base payments. In dispute resolution, we have made findings in recent years around timelines for both due process hearing and resolution sessions, that the state did not have a mechanism for tracking those or ensuring that the timelines were being met. Also around dispute resolution, both on state complaints and due process hearings, there is a requirement that states are able to ensure that any required corrective actions are made in a timely manner. And we've found in some states this has been an issue. So these are just some quick samples of some things that you might want to take a look at. We will be delving further into this. And as I said, you can go into our website, look at previous monitoring findings. I would also really urge you to work with your TA centers to talk to them about their knowledge and the resources that they have, which is a great segue into our next set of slides. Next slide, please. I'm gonna go through these really quickly. The next set of slides are just some links that our TA partners, NCSI and IDC on the Part B side, and ECTA and DAISY on the Part C side, have provided to us. Some of this you've seen before. These are the most relevant resources we think that the TA centers have related to the DMS process, and we really urge you to take a look at these. Again, you'll have access to this PowerPoint, obviously, so you'll be able to access them from there as well as directly from the websites. But some really great information on general supervision and different ways of looking at it. They've also, just go back one slide for a moment. I wanted to note at the bottom, you note at the bottom, reformatted DMS protocols for use in state planning. One of the things we heard from states when we got feedback on our protocols was that states really wanted to have the protocols in a fashion that would be useful for them to be able to provide their own information and look at it in different ways. And because we provided the template in the protocols in Word fashion, the TA centers were able to reformat them in a way that'll be useful for states to do. So that's another thing to take a look at. Okay, next slide, please. And so then TA Center resources, again, from IDC, from our partners in IDC, a lot of things around data that would be really helpful for you to take a look at, as well as SPP APR resources. So really urge you to take advantage of all these resources. Next slide, please. And again, a few more resources there for you to take a look at. So thank you. Let's move on to the next slide, please. And then on the Part C side, again, we have ECTA resources that will be helpful moving forward. You can see a few of those are coming soon, and we know that those will be useful to you moving ahead. Note that there's a new DMS 2.0 website for ECTA, so that's a one-stop shop for you to say, take a look at all of these. Next slide, please. And again, from DAISY, a lot of really good information on target setting, data processes, stakeholder knowledge, a lot of things that I think you will find useful, and we encourage you to take advantage of. And the next slide. There are some contacts again for your TA centers on the Part C side. I'm sure you know how to do that, but in case you don't, there you go. Next slide. And so finally, just some next steps. As we've mentioned, cohort 1, where the monitoring teams have been having the state kickoff calls. We'll be finishing those up in the next couple of weeks. We will be starting document requests, our first set of document requests for the states that we will be visiting in May and then in June, starting in December and January, and then starting those interviews for phase 1 that we've talked about. We do have our, as Greg mentioned, our next national TA call will be a DMS call scheduled on November 18th. Again, it's a different date because of the holiday schedule. And at that time, we expect to talk a little bit more specifically about some of the component-specific protocols that we have. So Again, we hope this is useful information to you. We know some of it is repeat, but we've heard that not all states are clear on some of this, so we're doing our best to provide clarity. If you have additional questions, please feel free to reach out to myself or Kate or any of you and your state leads directly. And with that, I think we can hand it off to the second half of our program to Lisa. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Matt, and thanks to my other colleagues. I appreciate you trying to save some time for me. Good afternoon, folks. I have a lot of information to share with you. I'll do my best to get through as much as we can in the time we have allotted. Before I dive into the IEP document, I just want to make clear that OSERS is issuing a series of documents to help support the full implementation of IDEA during the school year. And for you Part C folks, I know our references to school year aren't always that helpful, but as we're looking at expectations for Part C, we know many of you have continued to provide in-person services throughout much of the pandemic. The focus of our roadmap documents is really trying to support programs as they are returning to more face-to-face interactions with children with disabilities and their families, and of course infants and toddlers with disabilities and their families. To date, we have issued 3 documents in the series, and for our Part C friends, we're pleased and excited that we have 2 documents that are just on the verge of being released. We thank you for your patience. We know it's hard because there are so many questions that you're really hoping that we can provide some support for. So thank you again for your patience, and watch your mailboxes for these documents coming to you soon. Next slide, please. So I first want to go through sort of the critical messages that are communicated through the Part B document. I know we have a lot of Part C folks on the line participating today. While much of this is aimed toward Part B, there might be some information that you would also find helpful in your roles and considerations to think about as you move forward in implementing IDEA. But really there are a couple of bottom lines that OSEP has been consistent about emphasizing, and one of those bottom lines is making sure that IEPs are in effect at the beginning of the school year for each child with a disability that will provide that child with FAPE. Whether the child is being educated in person 100% of the time, whether the child is receiving services virtually or some hybrid. That's the message that we have been communicating. And in the IEP Q&A, we really do focus quite a bit on looking and making sure that all of a child's needs are being met, recognizing that the pandemic has had a tremendous impact on all of us, some of us more than others, and certainly our children with disabilities, infants and toddlers with disabilities and their families have experienced generally a greater impact than others. Some of those areas that are really key in terms of looking at properly supporting children with disabilities include assistive technology services and devices, looking at the social, emotional, behavioral, and mental health needs of the child and the child's family in the case of Part C. We know that IDEA does provide some flexibility in making changes to a child's IEP, including the excusal amendment provisions. I know many of you may have wondered how you would be accommodating so many requests perhaps, or the need to update, revise IEPs to make sure that they do address all of a child's needs for the current school year. Next slide, please. Throughout time, I think OSEP and certainly IDEA has emphasized the critical role that IEP teams have in making those individualized determinations about what is appropriate for each child, looking at their present levels of academic and functional achievement. And now in light of the pandemic, and OSEP has said in the past under other circumstances, for those of you in states who had the misfortune of experiencing natural disasters and having significant disruptions in services, looking at whether and to what extent compensatory services might be necessary to mitigate the impact of those disruption of services on a child's ability to receive appropriate services, in this case during the pandemic. I do beg your indulgence. I am battling a cold and I'm just trying to get through this. So please forgive me as I cough and I sniffle. You'll recall early on in March 2020, OSERS did send a message that there would likely need to be, at that point we had no idea, the extent of the pandemic and its impact, but we did send the message that IEP teams would need to determine whether and to what extent a child may need compensatory services to address the disruptions in their special ed and related services, as well as their early intervention services to an infant and toddler with a disability in their family. Next slide, please. Excuse me. Probably the area that we received the most questions about since the pandemic began, from you folks, from families and others interested in special education, is what about compensatory services? And you've waited and you've waited and you've waited, and the IEP Q&A probably provides more guidance and information about compensatory services than anything that the department has issued to date. So some of the things that folks asked us about is, what should IEP teams be looking at? You say that they're going to need to look at whether and to what extent. What are the factors? What are the kinds of things that they should be considering when coming together to make compensatory services decisions? I expect that the factors we came up with are likely the same factors that you have advised your local programs about in looking at compensatory services decisions, whether in view of the pandemic or in other circumstances. Excuse me. We did want to point out in the note, as you'll see in the slide, and you will find it in the content of the Q&A, that there are some places in the country where there is a controlling federal or state law, case law, maybe your SEA or an LEA has provided guidance that IEP teams have to follow when making compensatory services decisions. So if there is a specific case law that mandates or dictates how IEP teams make these decisions, then in your state, they would need to follow this. What OSEP has said in the Q&A, as well as communicated previously in states when they've asked us, is if an SEA or LEA gives guidance to their IEP teams, they must make sure that they allow for the individualized determination. It can't be, a cookie cutter approach where every child gets the same thing regardless of the potential impact. So if you have provided guidance to your LEAs to support IEP teams, as long as that guidance does not interfere with the individualized decision making for those teams, you're likely doing good things to support your LEAs. Next slide, please. A second area that we've just been flooded with calls about, and particularly our customer service team, we have a group of 4 individuals who are designated and truly devoted to taking calls from the public, usually parents and other family members. And they have been flooded with inquiries since the start of the pandemic. Usually it's, folks who are concerned about whether their children going physically to school to receive instruction and services will be safe for them. Others have called very concerned about whether virtual instruction has been or can be beneficial for their children. So, these calls continue. We wanted to make sure that in this document, we made clear that IEP teams have the responsibility for addressing school-related health needs for those children with disabilities who have underlying health conditions that really do put them at great risk if they contract COVID. In the Q&A, we note that, returning and reopening schools safely is really what's the most important. Oh my gosh, my computer says it's going to die in 4 minutes and 51 seconds, and it's not allowing me to cancel. Does anybody have any idea? No, I don't want to restart now. Okay, let's not do that. Okay, somebody is trying to help me, I think.
I think
Jennifer,
you can probably keep going, Lisa, if you click yeah. And if you cut out, we'll pick up where you stopped. And,
okay.
Yeah,
no,
but I think
it
may be unplugged, I think, rather than the restart. So make sure it's plugged in.
It is plugged in. It's
Okay.
just it's doing that thing that our
yeah, just keep going, and if
Yep.
it pushes, we'll pick up.
Okay, like anything else bad can happen today with my showing up for this. So in any case, we wanted to make clear that it is part of an IEP team's job, and I think that's the next slide, Swati, please. That IEP teams have the responsibility to consider and address any school-related health needs of a child with a disability who is at increased risk if they get COVID. And so we include a series of questions that talk about the IEP team and placement team, if different, responsibilities for considering supplementary aids and services to address the school-related health needs of children who do have these underlying medical conditions that put them at greater risk. Because we want to make sure that that teams are looking at what are the ways to keep a child safe. So we don't want parents to have to choose between a placement where their children will be safe versus a placement where they're not able to access their education and be educated with other children with disabilities. So again, looking at supplementary aids and services in the development of the IEP, also looking at them in the context of ensuring placement in the least restrictive environment. Next slide, please. So
Lisa, just to jump in, if you do drop off, you can call in, and I'll make sure you have the number. Okay?
Will you text me the number, please?
I will. Yep, so you can call in right away. Okay.
Okay. Thank you, guys.
Yep.
Thanks so much. I appreciate all the supplementary aids and services I'm getting to get through this call today. Thank you. So let's see, the slide that I'm on now is really making clear that IDA says that any state or local laws or regs that all of your procedures need to be consistent with IDEA. So that is the framework for making clear that state or local laws, regulations, rules, or policies that prohibit or limit those kinds of COVID prevention and risk reduction strategies could be inconsistent with that requirement in IDEA, as it could limit the continuum of educational placements available to children with disabilities. We also cite to the 1984 Supreme Court decision that made clear health-related services that are needed for a child with a disability to benefit from their special education must be provided as part of FAPE. And you'll also see that we emphasize throughout the document your role as an SEA and our role as an oversight agency to ensure that these requirements are met. Next slide, please. And I see we have a question. I'm going to hold on to those and see if I get all the way through. And if we can't address the questions today, we will do some follow-up so that your questions can get answered. The next slide, please, around ESY and compensatory services. We thought it was particularly important to distinguish the purposes of ESY and compensatory services because those purposes are different. How the need for these services are determined may be different. We know ESY, the criteria, those are all left to states to decide. With respect to compensatory services, we provided some guidance around that. Again, there may be state law or other I'm getting all kinds of messages, guys. Let me just focus here. Okay, that there.
Okay, so she popped off and we'll just wait because I believe she'll probably be able to call back in. We sent her that number, but we'll continue to go through. So this is one of the most critical messages that is in it around the ESY and compensatory services. So looking at those guidance documents under E1 and E2 that these services do have different standards and purposes around them. So really taking into consideration the loss that has occurred and having that IEP team taking those considerations into effect as they're examining a student. So looking at standards and the specific needs of the child, not unlike what you would do for ESY services or at any time when we're thinking about compensatory services, really thinking about what is the need and if there has been learning loss that has occurred as a result of the time away from instruction, away from the building, or the different methodology that the service was provided under. So just highlighting under questions E1 and E2 that our students do have that entitlement to those ESY services to ensure that FAPE continues to be applied. So I guess we'll go to the next slide, please, Swati. And let me just see if she's calling in. Maybe JBZ, you could be texting her as well. So this definition of supplementary aids and services, so highlighting that aids and services and other supports that are provided in the regular education class, other educational related settings, and in extracurricular non-academic settings to enable children and disabilities to be educated with non-disabled children to the maximum extent appropriate. So that is used throughout the document. And Swati, I think I had the wrong meeting passcode. So if you can type that into the chat, I can provide that to Lisa. So just highlighting under the hyperlinked regulations that are there. So please review that information and taking in those supplementary aids and services when we're thinking about compensatory services would also come into play. So the IEP team would want to be considering those.
I'm back, Kate.
Oh, yay. Okay. Do you want to go back to supplementary aids and services? Or do you want to move on?
Yeah, if you've already, well, I mean, the one thing that I will say about, I don't know if you guys can see me.
Yep,
there I am.
See you now. Yeah,
I am so sorry. This is going to be the worst video webinar ever.
We kept going on. I picked right up.
Hey, look, thanks everybody for hanging in. I really appreciate it. One of the things, if we can just go back to the supplementary aids and services slide, I think it's 29, just real quick. The reason that I wanted to spend a little bit, just highlight here, how often we always talk about special and related services, but we don't typically talk about supplementary aids and services. It's just like such a mouthful. You will find this term, scattered throughout the document, because again, because of what children and their families have endured through the pandemic, we are thinking that there might be new needs, there might be change needs, and really taking a look at what supplementary aids and services may be necessary in order for children to be educated in regular ed classrooms and other settings to the maximum extent appropriate with children without disabilities. So just remembering that supplementary aids and services is a critical component to both IEP development as well as placement determination. So now let's move on. And I'm sure that Kate probably covered all of this. Again, these we're on specific details now. We're out of the critical messages and kind of getting in a little bit deeper. But again, making sure that children, have IEPs that will give them FAPE, regardless of what mode of instruction or where that instruction is taking place, is of utmost importance. Next slide, please. Some of the messaging behind the couple of points on this slide is a recognition that that the IEPs that may have been developed before the start of this school year may need to be changed to reflect how services are going to be provided if schools were able to open full-time in-person learning. And that was an expectation the department had set. So there might be a need for IEP teams to meet to adjust those IEPs to reflect the provision of FAPE in that face-to-face setting full-time. I've already talked about children experiencing new and additional issues that may require special ed and related services, perhaps those supplementary aids and services. So again, just recognizing that what was in place at the end of last school year might not meet a child's needs for the 2021-2022 school year. Next slide, please. So we also discussed the longstanding position about contingency planning. This has been in some of our previous disaster guidance on responding to disasters, I guess I should say. And the idea that IEP teams, it might be helpful for an IEP team to look at what will be provided to a child if the situation changes, if a child needs to go out for a period of time as a result of some unexpected event or unanticipated event. And since we're still in the throes of the pandemic. The next slide, please. So the two factors you see on the slide here, they have always been considerations in the development and revision of IEPs. I think during the pandemic, the use of virtual learning, many of us became more keenly aware of how important assistive technology can be in the education of children with disabilities. And also the additional support that families may need in learning how to support their child in using assistive technology devices. We also want to profile and highlight the need to ensure that the behavioral needs of children with disabilities are appropriately addressed as they return to in-person learning. Next slide, please. I'm going to move through these kind of quickly so we can get further into the presentation, but we do feature a couple of questions around assistive technology that have come up. There's actually, I think, some language in there about the importance of states looking at the equitable access to technology in their states. As we know, there were considerable challenges in ensuring equitable access to technology, to Wi-Fi, so that the children could access virtual learning during earlier parts of the pandemic. Next slide, please. So the Q&A goes into some detail about addressing the needs of a child who has behavior that interferes with their learning or that of others. One of the things that has struck me in working on this series of guidance that I haven't necessarily seen as much in previous guidance, and I've been with OSEP for 15 years now, is in the roadmap documents, we thought it was particularly important to provide examples and suggestions where we could on things. And so in this slide and in the Q&A where we talk about, what are some examples of services that can be provided to address a child's behavioral needs, we do give some examples of what might be a supplementary aid and service, what might be covered in terms of special education and related services. So we hope you find that helpful. Next slide, please. I don't know how many of you have struggled with the term, what is a modification versus an accommodation? So as we were working on this guidance, we had to make clear and be sure that what we were talking about were truly modifications. So we've provided a few examples of those. And we've also addressed in the Q&A some steps IEP teams can take when considering behavioral supports for children with disabilities. We have a number of journal articles that we've cited. We've cited some states documents that we thought were good examples that other states might learn something from. So we hope that by looking at that information that helps you as you're supporting your local programs during very challenging times. Next slide, please. So, yep, here we are back to compensatory services. One of the things that we wanted to make clear was how important it is to take into consideration information from parents, since they've been working with their children much more closely during the pandemic than probably in the past, and they would have information to bring to the IEP team when talking about whether compensatory services are needed to address the disruption in services to the child. We think, it's likely in some cases teams may need to consider whether they have sufficient data to determine current levels of performance, or whether they need to obtain updated assessments in order to move forward on those kinds of decisions. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we included in this guidance was not necessarily a laundry list. It's not exhaustive, but we did provide examples of when compensatory services might be warranted. Oftentimes, it's just been thought of that compensatory services were only in the case of where IEP services were missed. But with the pandemic and delays in evaluations, delays in providing transition from Part C to Part B, or providing appropriate secondary transition, there could be all kinds of situations beyond just IEP services being missed to warrant a discussion about compensatory services and making up for the inability or the failure of an LEA to be able to implement a child's IEP and to address any lack of progress. I think I'm ready to move to the next slide, please. There's also a section in the Q&A, and I think the question earlier relates to making educational placements. The department, OSEP, spoke about historically we have looked at children being at home and receiving services in their IEPs as being the most restrictive placement. But, with the pandemic and so many other children being educated virtually, depending on how it's set up, there really could be a least restrictive environment for a child with a disability. They may have interactions with their non-disabled peers through virtual interaction. So we really we're distinguishing that virtual instruction from what we have historically looked at as placement in the home, so to speak. So Section G of the Q&A addresses the importance of IEP and placement teams and making sure that IEPs will provide FAPE and that children with disabilities are educated in the least restrictive environment. As you know, none of the IDA requirements were waived, so that includes LRE. Let's move on to the next slide, please. One of the points that we wanted to make is that LEAs should not be providing virtual instruction to children with disabilities when non-disabled peers are receiving in-person instruction. And that's sort of a strong statement, but it's basically, you know, when an LEA offers virtual instruction, in-person learning, or hybrid, those are decisions made at the state and local levels. But we do want to caution that children with disabilities would not categorically be kept at home on virtual instruction when opportunities for in-person instruction are made for their non-disabled peers. We think it's really important that states pay close attention to how their LEAs are offering virtual instruction, to which students, under what circumstances, and to ensure that for all children with disabilities, that they have IEPs that provide FAPE through that mode of instruction. So if you're doing virtual instruction, the child is able to receive FAPE that way. Real quick, on to the next slide, please. Resolving disagreements around compensatory services. We thought it was important to make clear that, like other IEP team decisions, a parent can use IDA's dispute resolution procedures to resolve disagreements about that. We're hoping that with IEP teams making the decision and parents being part of those IEP teams, that will help to mitigate some of the complaints, some of the due process complaints. We know it's not always going to be a situation where the parent's in full agreement. They may disagree with the amount, the nature, or a decision to provide services at all. So we wanted to make clear that it's important that states review their procedural safeguards notice to make sure they understand the applicable timelines for pursuing these procedures. So this is the same PowerPoint that we use to present to the PTIs, OSEP's PTIs, Technical Assistance Centers, as well as at NASD's conference last week. So we're communicating these same points across audiences. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is the point where I would go on to the Dear Colleague letter. I'm wondering if we need to maybe save this for another day. Greg, I don't know if you guys want to chime in here.
Yeah, I think that probably makes sense, Lisa.
Yeah.
It is 5 o'clock, and I know folks probably need to move on to other parts of their day.
I think that's right. But if you look at those other documents that were issued in August, if you have questions about them, please feel free to get in touch with your state lead, or you can feel free to contact me. My name is Lisa Pagano. I have the same email kind of configuration as your state lead. So it's lisa.pagano@ed.gov. And we'll be happy to try to clarify anything you have questions about. So yes. Ooh, hard questions coming in. So due to intense state of politics, what will you do if an SEA has been directed by a governor, state superintendent to take actions contrary to OSEP guidance or IDEA? If you look in the guidance, we do have a question about OSEP monitoring and what we could choose to do. I'm drawing a blank right now. Let me try to hurry up and get to it. You may want to look quickly at question C11. And we say, in situations where the department finds non-compliance and voluntary compliance cannot be readily achieved, the department will consider all its enforcement options, including referral to the U.S. Department of Justice. So that's question and answer C11. So take a look at that. And if you would like to discuss further, again, please follow up with your state lead or feel free to write to me. And I am so super sorry about my disgusting voice and coughing and my untimely dying of my computer. Thanks for hanging in there with me.
Thanks, Lisa. And thank you everyone for joining us today. We're going to wrap it up. We'll see you again next month. Remember, a week early. We hope you have a good month, and we'll see you again soon. Thanks, everybody.